I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which tea works has been the site of human activity for over 15,000 years. Toronto to Toronto is the territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and is now the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, also known as the Toronto Purchase with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a settler organization, it is important to recognize that we benefit from colonial systems of extraction and land dispossession, and that environmental degradation, climate change, pollution, and waste, which our work aims to prevent, are deeply connected to colonialism. To address the root causes of these issues, our environmental work must strive to disrupt colonialism and support Indigenous people. As we move to a new council term, I'm thinking about how settler people like me and settler organizations like T can take up their responsibilities. Toronto has a reconciliation action plan, and it outlines values and principles. One of them is right relations. I quote, "The city is committed to actively forming relationships through meaningful engagement, partnership, collaboration, and co-development, and power shifting and sharing with Indigenous communities and organizations. The city values truth and the importance of Indigenous phrases, nothing about us without us, and Indigenous by Indigenous. Writing relations is an obligation to live up to the responsibilities involved when taking part in these relationships, be it to other humans, other species, the land and waters, or the climate, and requires respect, reciprocity, and just actions." So for me, part of the work that lies ahead is to hold the city accountable to this commitment and to deepen our understanding of how we at T can also meaningfully integrate this into our work. So I'd like to really welcome all of you today to our Election Debrief webinar. It's really an exciting time, I believe, to address the very significant challenges that lie ahead, but also to bring a bold vision of change to City Council, to City Hall. So without further ado, I'd like to just kick off with a few introductions. My name is Ma Ma, I'm the Executive Director at T, and I'd like to introduce the team that's with me here today. So I have Sarah Buchanan, our Campaigns Director. I have Emily Alfred, our Waste Campaigner. And I have our newest team member, Hao Sen Chong, who is our incoming climate campaigner. And so as we begin this exciting conversation, which we're so glad you're joining us for, I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Hey everyone, I just want to say a big hello. I'm so excited to be here with our T supporters and be here with our campaigns team as well. We thought today we wanted to kind of bring you behind the curtain a little bit and bring you into what honestly will feel a little bit like one of our campaigns team meetings might feel like. And so I'm going to start with a quick just presentation to let you know a little bit about what we actually asked for this election, what we did. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you might not have seen it. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen here and show what we asked for here. So this is just a quick run through of T's Vote for a Greener City for All campaign. And we had basically three big planks that we wanted to bring in front of not only the public, but also to candidates as well. And we had three big focus areas in our pledge for candidates. You're seeing one focus area right in front of you right now on climate action. And so what we wanted to do was ask candidates to commit to specific things that if elected, they were going to do this term. And we tried to pick a few achievable things that we knew were going to be coming up actually at council for potential votes this term. We also picked what we felt were issues that had been close votes in the past. And so we picked a few of the thornier ones that we knew were going to be close votes again, and that we really wanted to make sure we got some sort of commitment that we could hold councillors or elected officials accountable on this term. I'll mention too that there are four pledge asks and that, it's a relatively low number, I think, compared to some other pledges that were out there. You might wonder, why are there only 4 asks? If you have the ability to ask councillors to or mayors to do things, why not ask them to do like 30,000 things? We want them to do a lot. The reason we picked only 4 is because we really, again, we wanted to pick things that we felt were close votes and that we felt we could track and really hold those elected officials accountable on. Things that we felt were also incredibly important to the functioning of Toronto and to our environmental priorities. So the first one here is climate action. And really the big ask here is one that we've asked for before. We're asking for it again. And we're reminding elected folks that they actually did commit in Toronto's climate emergency declaration to looking for new sustained and equitable climate funding tools to fund Toronto's climate action plan. We're going to dig a little bit more into what that means a little bit later in this webinar. Another big area we focused on was climate resilience. So we all know that climate change we're seeing those impacts get worse and worse in Toronto. We're feeling the heat more and more, particularly folks who might not have access to cool spaces or air conditioning. And we're seeing more and more flooding with increased severity of storms. So we did ask for a couple of big commitments on climate resilience to make sure that we're keeping folks, particularly folks who are most impacted by climate change, keeping folks protected. One of those is a review of Toronto's heating and cooling bylaws with an eye on a maximum safe temperature for rental units. Another is a fair stormwater charge. Again, I'm going to get into this more a little bit later, but it's something that has come up a lot at council, and we really want to try to build that majority of support for. And another big area that we asked councillors and mayor candidates to pledge on was waste in a circular economy. We've done a ton of great work in that area. We focused in on something we knew was going to be coming before council, which was the single-use reduction strategy, and asking for their commitment on voting for that. And Emily, our waste campaigner, is going to tell you a little bit more about that as well. And so those were the big focused areas. And here's the results. All these green wards are the folks who actually did take our pledge, who ended up being elected. So we obviously had more than one candidate signing on in most wards, but of the folks who actually were elected on election night, we saw 15 of 25 of them were candidates who took T's pledge. That's great news because it is a majority of candidates. So if all of these folks actually stick to their word and vote for the priorities that we've laid out here, then we should be looking at some really strong movement on these big key environmental areas in the next term. And you can see here that we do have, obviously there's a little bit more representation in the downtown core, but there's definitely some strong representation also from outside the downtown core here. So this is sort of the geography that we're looking at across the city. I'm going to zoom out a little bit and I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen. Maybe I'll give you a second to let you take this in. And I also want to mention here that even the folks that are not green here, T works with and communicates with all councillors. So we're going to be working hard to get our priorities in front of every single one of these councillors, even the ones who haven't turned green. We're going to be working hard to turn this as green as possible. And to make sure that, that folks actually follow through on those commitments. We know with pledges that, they're not always followed. That's another reason we picked a smaller number of priorities, is so that we could really do that watchdog and accountability work, which frankly, we're going to need all of our supporters, that's you, for as well. Okay, so I will stop sharing so you can see all of our lovely faces. And I think Aimee is going to kick off our discussion portion as well.
I like the image that evokes, Sarah, of turning councillors green. I just pictured, council chambers with all these little green people, like a little alien convention. So now we're just going to take a slightly deeper dive, now that Sarah's presented the overview, around, some of the focus areas that we did include in the platform and pledge. And I think I'll go over to you first, Emily, to talk a bit about our demands for waste action.
Great, thanks. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, there's a lot of things we're going to be paying attention to in the next 4 years. There's a lot of work the council has to do to ensure we meet our waste diversion goals. And we chose the single-use and takeaway items reduction strategy. It's a bit of a mouthful. The single-use reduction strategy is a shorter way to say the same thing. We chose that as a really good symbolic leadership move, because this is something council has been working on for at least 4 years. Since 2018, they've been consulting with the public, showing there's really broad public support for council to enact a strategy that includes restrictions and bans on things like cups, bags, takeout food containers, those things that really show up as litter in the city, but also the city can have some control over preventing those from being created in the first place. We've seen cities in other parts of Canada and other parts of the US and around the world are passing regulations to require, for example, that restaurants only give you condiments and accessories when you ask for it, that they only, or that they have to require, or they have to provide reusable cups and dishes if you're dining in, even for fast food restaurants. So this is the kind of like bold strategy that we really want to see in Toronto. We don't want to see any sort of, 5-cent fee added in 5 years from now. We really need the city to push ahead and do this right now. And we also know that there's a lot of pushback from major chains and from the companies that make styrofoam and single-use plastics and takeout foodware. So, we know this is probably coming up in early 2023, not sure exactly. And we want to ensure that this is the best strategy possible and that it not only reduces and discourages single use, but that it actually requires reusables. So, we're excited about talking with councillors about the different ways what that can look like. We've seen from our research, talking to small businesses and research around the world, that you need regulations to do this. The voluntary system is what we have, and that's why we have too much garbage. So, it'll take courage and it will take leadership for the city to do this. We've also started a group called Reusable Toronto. So we've pulled together reuse champions, small businesses that are leading on reuse and reusable containers and takeout things, as well as researchers. And we're really trying to show how this can be a solution for Toronto. So that's something we'll be looking at.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to go over to you next, Sarah, to talk a little bit about some of the climate action that we're calling for. There has been a lot of momentum in terms of getting our new net zero Transform TO climate strategy adopted, but we still have a long way to go. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
For sure. I know Emily mentioned, the need for transformative action, not just those, small kind of incremental changes. This is a window that is incredibly important for not just waste action, but climate action, as we know. So that's why, we know, frankly, that the city can't take the kind of climate action that it needs to take and plans to take in their existing strategies that councillors have voted for without more money. They cannot do it in the budget that they have allotted to them right now. It just, the math does not add up. So it's kind of been the elephant in the room for a long time. And it's something that we know with some dedicated ongoing revenue tools. One example I like to use is maybe like a parking levy. So, when folks, we know that pavement and parking lots can create a lot of problems, not just stormwater, but also encouraging people to be driving into downtown. Some sort of a dedicated charge that is sort of equitably distributed can help feed into funding the city's climate plan, funding transportation options that are low carbon. So that's something that the city's own reports say could bring in hundreds of millions of dollars every single year into the city budget, but they're not doing it. So we need that to happen. The city has good options in front of them for dedicated revenue tools that mean we don't have to go to council every single budget year and say, do what you said you were going to do to fund your climate plan. It's exhausting. And frankly, we're not gonna make it to our targets if that keeps having to happen. So that's the root of the really big ask to get councillors and the mayor to support a dedicated ongoing tool and put their money where their mouth is on this really, really important thing, and make sure it's a tool that's equitable as well, and prioritizes folks who are experiencing those really, really disastrous impacts of climate change most. I also know, I actually want to pivot to House End for a second, because it's important to get an understanding of where our emissions come from in Toronto. What are the major sources? just to know a little bit more about what needs to happen. Hassan, do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So in 2020, which is the last year we have a full account of what the emissions in Toronto were, there was about a 12% drop in the emissions rate. However, 2020 was when COVID hit and when the entire world more or less shut down. And so if we're looking at the 2019 numbers, which is probably a lot more accurate look at what the 2021 numbers are going to be, that's about 15 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. A full roughly 60%, 57 to 60% of those emissions come from buildings, primarily from things like fossilized natural gas, things like that. And then a lot of people usually think that our emissions primarily come from transportation. In a city like Toronto, it's closer to about a third, about 36% of those emissions, and the remaining 7% come from waste. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. The council has already previously approved targets that would reduce emissions down by 2025 and 2030. But we're talking about a 2025 target of a 28% reduction from 2019. And so that means in order to do that, we do need the revenue tools. We need bold new thinking and bold plans to come in order to ensure that we actually meet these targets. Without the actual tools that include revenue tools to meet these targets, we're just not going to be able to do that. And as we know that, we are one of the wealthier, more prosperous cities and communities on the planet, we have a responsibility to do that, not just for the people who live here, but for people globally as well. So that's an important thing for people to know and for people to recognize how deep this challenge is, but how with just a little bit of bravery from City Council, and a little bit of help from the province, a little bit of help from the federal government, which we're seeing with things like green car standards and slightly greener, although it's going up a little bit now. Electricity systems will be able to actually meet those. But yeah, the time now really is for City Council to put in the resources necessary to meet these goals, because we've now reached that point where some more challenging actions need to be made.
Yes, and we've said many times, we cannot kick this can further down the road. I do want to come back to one point that you raised, Sarah, about climate action. Often we think about that as mitigation related actions, but you've raised an important point about supporting communities that are directly impacted by extreme weather. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that aspect of our platform?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've really highlighted some tools in there that can help with adapting to the increasing impacts of climate change. One of these impacts is also a revenue tool that could bring in more money, and that's a stormwater charge. It's something that lots of municipalities around Toronto are already using. It's come up too many times to count at council, and it is a can that has been kicked many times down the road. And so it's what it is, really, really briefly, is essentially a way to disincentivize pavement because we're getting more intense storms, more intense rainwater, all that runoff with more and more pavement. We just have way too much of it in Toronto, goes into our sewers, comes up in people's basements. It's getting worse and worse, and tons of folks, probably many folks on this webinar right now, have experienced the impacts of that flooding. And a stormwater charge would essentially mean that big pavement, as I like to call them, parking lot owners, for example, don't actually pay anything into our water system, which is the system that has to pay to fix all of this flooding and build bigger sewers, et cetera. So a stormwater charge, one way that it would help is it would mean that it would, based on how much of a big pavement area they have, make big pavement pay into these flooding fixes and potentially new flooding fixes, things like green infrastructure that we do need more funding for. It's been a long road, and it's something that we're going to keep you updated on as supporters about what you can do to help push for this. And we know that it's going to be coming up again this term.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to move to the next question, and I'm going to come to you first, Hassan. I mean, we've talked about the scope and scale of the work that needs to be done in terms of climate action, but realistically, we are experiencing some very significant barriers. And I say we, those of us who are advocating for the type of change and the pace of change that we need. Maybe you can speak a little bit to some of the barriers that we're seeing emerging right now.
Yeah, I mean, just as the other levels of government can be helpful in terms of some of the rules that they bring down, they could also be harmful, and sometimes they don't necessarily do it on purpose. But for example, Bill 23, which is a bill that the provincial government has just presented for debate and potentially some amendment, is originally meant to help increase the number of houses and increase the housing stock in Ontario, which is great. We need more housing. We're in a housing crisis. That's clearly something that's necessary. The trouble is the method in which they're doing that will have the effect of eliminating Toronto's ability to dictate and to state what the minimum energy and environmental requirements for these homes are going to be. That's a very big problem. This particular rule at Toronto is called the Toronto Green Standard. It's been around since 2010. We are now on the 4th version that just started off, and each additional version has higher and higher standards as the technology and the processes get better and more efficient. And so what we're seeing now is with this particular bill is that there may be, unfortunately, and that may have an effect of eliminating Toronto's key tool to do that. And so what that would do is it would actually download a lot of the costs onto homeowners and onto renters. It would make things more expensive for homeowners and renters because suddenly they have to pay more for energy because the insulation isn't good enough and the water standards aren't good enough, so they have to pay more for water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we need these rules at these higher levels of government to ensure to be as stringent, if not more stringent, as the rules that we have in Toronto. Otherwise, it makes it very, very difficult for the city of Toronto to follow through on our very, very ambitious reduction goals.
I can jump in too. I think that, to put it bluntly, the province needs to stop intervening in Toronto's, general business, but we're talking about environmental issues right now. So the province needs to stop undermining Toronto's ability to protect its own environment. We also see they're ramping up natural gas in the electricity grid. That essentially makes it impossible for Toronto to hit net zero emissions and other municipalities. So has a huge impact on what Toronto can do and how far we can go. So it's a huge concern, and that's going to be a barrier for sure.
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to note to our participants, what our team has chatted. We're having a little challenge with our chat function. So if you do have questions for us, if you can please use the Q&A function. We are going to wrap up this part of the conversation as promised at 1, but we will hang back to take some questions. So please do use the Q&A function if you can. I want to go back to your point about the province interfering with the city of Toronto, Sarah. I mean, a big topic of conversation during the municipal election was the strong mayor powers that were tabled by the province. Maybe you can speak to how you see that potentially impacting City Hall focused work going forward.
Yeah, it's a big question mark. And obviously it's something that, our hope really is that the mayor would kind of respect those local democratic processes and respect that people voted for local representatives who need to have a voice and need to not be just kind of like walked over when it comes to important decisions. But we're going to be watching this first budget cycle really, really closely to see if those powers are used, how it all plays out, and it could be it could be a really big factor in how our next steps and particularly how our climate plan is funded and whether it's funded. So that's something that we're going to be watching really closely. And we do really want, we want people's voices to be heard on this, and we want it to be not just one person, having such tight control over everything that happens in that budget.
I mean, now we're in the immediate post-election period, Sarah. I mean, overall, are we in a better position now to move some of our key issues forward? What's your read on the situation?
Yeah, I actually do feel I feel pretty hopeful, more so honestly than I have after some other elections. And I think that looking at the results of our pledge, like we have, you know, potentially a majority on some big issues. I'm not sure if that's an indicator of the tides turning a little bit on some of these key priorities, that sort of window of sort of public sentiment and political will kind of gradually creaking over towards taking more action on some of these issues. You know, we saw some polling come out in the election saying that 72% of those polled said Toronto should invest now in transit, bike lanes, sidewalks, tree coverage to fight climate change, and do what it takes essentially. So that was helpful to see. Another interesting fact is that, you know, incumbents, some of the incumbents that we saw, there were 9 incumbent councillors who signed our pledge and 6 new councillors. Some of the incumbents actually pledged to support items that they have previously voted against. For example, a stormwater charge. And so obviously we're going to be watching those really closely, but that could be an indication that they're potentially willing to shift or you know, consider different ways of doing things.
Thanks, Sarah. Emily, I'm going to come to you with the big action question. And so really, you know, in terms of moving forward, what can T and the public do to move forward some of these very big challenges and issues that a lot of us, including folks who are on this webinar with us, have been working on for years? You know, what is on the horizon that we can action, and how are we going to go about doing that?
Mm-hmm. That's the big question, isn't it? And I see that question just come in the chat too. How do we do this stuff? So I think something that Sarah just said is really important to remember. So we've got 9 incumbent councillors. Some of them, like, we've worked with all of them before, right? We've had meetings with them, we've talked with them, we know their position on things from the past. We also have 6 new councillors. So one thing that T will be doing that's really critical, and I know like one of the first things we're already talking about right now, is setting up meetings with these councillors to educate them on these issues, to find out where they stand on them, to ensure that they understand, you know, what the sort of policy implications are, what the policy options are. So we'll really be spending that time to bring new councillors up to speed and talk to previous councillors about, you know, their concerns. So there's that sort of like, you know, just talking with them. We'll also be talking with the public and talking with the media and getting those issues like on the table, having those like public conversations so people are really putting that pressure on councillors. And that's where we need our supporters, like T supporters, and, you know, working with our allied organizations and with the general public, really helping hold council accountable. So that's with things like petitions, speaking to councillors, letting councillors know what the public wants and that they expect them to take action on these important issues. Because really, you know, the pledges are valuable. They're a good way to, like, you know, sort of show some commitment. But as Sarah has said a few times, we really have to do the follow through. And that's where, you know, T's role as a watchdog and being at those council meetings and reading those reports and paying close attention means that we can, you know, alert our supporters and alert our allies when those important votes are coming up so that, you know, people can be ready to act.
Thanks, Emily. We certainly will have a very full program of action in the coming 12 months. We are at 1 o'clock now. That half hour flew by, but we are going to stay on the line a little bit longer. We do have some questions, and our very kind back-end team that's going to be organizing is going to start feeding us some of these questions so we can start speaking to that. So we hope that you can stick around. For those who need to continue on to other things in your day, thanks so much for joining us, and we do hope to continue this conversation. So now I'm just going to try to turn to some of the questions. The first questions we have questions on emission scope. So one, for most organizations, scope 3 is way bigger than scope 1 and 2. Has the city assessed this? So we know there is a commitment here. Sarah, are you, would you speak to this one?
Yeah, I can do a little bit of a what I know update. It's definitely like a complex area. Excuse me. Scope 3 emissions, you know, really, we're thinking about all of the greenhouse gas emissions created by, for example, when you buy an item, how many emissions are created in the production of that item potentially. Those aren't considered in Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions tally right now. Excuse me, sorry. But if we started counting those, you know, that would have huge implications on hitting our climate targets. So that's something that the city has talked about and considered. There's going to be some new reports coming forward in this year and in 2024 about how the city counts emissions. So we're going to be watching that really closely. We'd love for them to incorporate a whole lot more. Excuse me. And I know Emily has actually been doing a lot of tracking on how waste emissions are counted. It's not really properly counted right now. And the city actually has some goals that to, you know, essentially eliminate emissions from organics that are supposed to dovetail with the climate plan, but aren't really being totally considered. So the city has so much more to do, I think, on thinking more comprehensively about where those emissions come from and changing how we do some of that accounting for sure.
So I think there's a part 2 to this, and maybe Emily, you can speak a little bit to it. So when do we get accounting upfront of embedded emissions in waste and end of life when waste is taken outside the city?
Yeah, so I think it's a similar answer really. Embedded emissions and waste is part of the scope 3 emissions. So when the city starts looking at all the sources of all the greenhouse gas emissions caused by Torontonians living their lives, not just things that we emit here, but if we're importing all our food, that's more emissions than if we're growing our food here. So, you know, the city has committed to doing that kind of emissions inventory. When they do, it will dramatically increase. As you know, the audience member pointed out, this is going to dramatically increase the amount of emissions the city has to deal with, which, you know, speaks again, it's even more important than ever that the city funds the current plan and gets on with it, dealing with buildings and transportation, getting those things underway right now. It's even more critical because once these new emissions sort of accounting methods come in, we'll have some other questions to answer. So I think it's all to be determined.
Thanks, Emily. So we do have more climate related questions on deck. So, you know, another question is about the cost, like how much does climate cost Toronto? You know, things like storm damage, tree damage, electrical grids being down. I'm not sure that we have that fully quantified at this point, but maybe Hao-San, if you want to make a remark about how we can and should be accounting for that kind of cost.
Yeah, and this is one of the key things as well, is oftentimes these costs aren't necessarily accounted for when the city is like doing the budgeting process of like, oh, well, you know, here we're going to do a budget on this, but because the city isn't necessarily thinking about like the additional costs of like what storm damage is, because a lot of those costs come from like insurance companies, for example, or entities that don't give that cost accounting onto the city, then it's important that like that type of information is included. What we do know for sure is that the cost of climate action is always far less expensive than the actual costs of climate damage itself. The main reason why these things aren't occurring, and one of the main reasons from an accounting perspective, is, as I said before, the costs and the people who are paying for the actual mitigation are often two different entities at different levels. Sometimes some of them are international, sometimes some of them are local. And so that's another reason why it's incredibly important, why the city needs to make sure that its climate action plan is funded properly and done so in a good way, because the costs will end up coming down on individual residents, and those costs are very, very significant.
Yeah, they're very significant. And as Sarah's put in the chat, a motion was actually moved on this front. And it's something that we'll be monitoring and following up. The other thing I want to add, and this has been a major focus of T's budget campaigns, is that the city has committed to applying a climate lens to all major decisions, including budget decisions. Now, I think we saw the last budget cycle that some attempt was made towards that, but it was not fully applying a climate lens where the climate accounting methodology was fully fleshed out by the city, which the city did acknowledge. So going into this budget cycle, which we are right on the horizon of now, we really will be looking to see how seriously a climate lens is being applied to major decisions, including spending decisions. So if you have questions, please do keep them coming. I am not able to always live see all your questions in the chat, so I'll look to my team to keep feeding questions. Sarah, you wanted to jump in on something?
Yeah, there's one question that stuck out to me too. Just talking about, what can Toronto do about this problem where we're relying on an electricity grid that's getting dirtier, but Toronto also needs to, essentially have zero emissions to meet its target. Like, how do we reconcile those things and what can we do? And I definitely don't have an overall solution to that, but I just want to talk about the importance of a couple things. One of them is, Toronto doing whatever is possible to support those local sources of renewable energy. So whether that's having a plan to support more folks to like put solar panels on their roofs, people who have roofs, to be able to do that with, have those what they call distributed energy resources, to be able to, within the city of Toronto, build up our share of renewable energy. And that can look like communities coming together to have, solar farms that they have invested in as a community. That can look like, the big wind turbine that you see down on the shores of Lake Ontario. So, we can and we should produce more renewable energy here in Toronto. There's a need for it, to have it to have that produced close to where it's used. So that's something we can move forward on more. And also, frankly, we have to work with other municipalities too, to speak up about the impacts of the grid getting dirtier. Toronto alone isn't going to be able to fight everything that the province does. It's something that we need other voices to jump in on, and they have jumped in on, but we have to think of this, pretty holistically as well. To put it bluntly, Doug Ford doesn't always pay attention too much to what folks in Toronto are saying. So we really have to, we have to work collaboratively with others.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. I mean, we always are looking at that whole picture, and we're trying to hold the city accountable for what is within its powers to do, and not try to sort of deflect to other levels of government. But we fully recognize just the significant impact in terms of policy decisions, but also resourcing that other orders of government have on our city. So that very much connects with our advocacy. I do want to we've had a few questions about how we're going to work with community members in terms of bringing them into our advocacy efforts towards council and mayor. So I would like to invite maybe Emily and Sarah to talk about how T is thinking about working with community members and, applying some pressure on the new council for some of our campaigns.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I mentioned a little bit of this before, but I think, as I said, we'll be meeting with councillors, doing that necessary education on the issues. Councillors have a lot on their plates, especially with these double mega wards that all these councillors are now dealing with. And we have a lot of new councillors who are just getting their feet, finding their feet on the job. It's a good opportunity for us to get in there and talk with those councillors and help them understand the issues and what sorts of policy solutions environmental groups are advocating for. So we'll be doing a lot of that. And I think, it's a great time when there are votes coming up and when we know councillors have those questions is exactly when we need our supporters. And we'll be mobilizing supporters with petitions or, calls to action. Depending on the issue, maybe people can meet with their councillors. I saw there was a comment in here suggesting that we bring neighborhood groups and local constituents. That's definitely something that we will be doing. I know for our single-use strategy and talking about how to reduce single-use items. And the Reusable Toronto group will be finding local businesses and local researchers and local community groups to come talk to councillors, to dispel any myths that businesses and researchers don't want this. So we really want to show that there's such broad support for these things. So that'll be a big part of our strategy. I'm sure Sarah has something to add too.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's such a great reminder that, really the power to change these things at the city level rests in the power of constituents, and that, if I'm going into a meeting with a councillor about the need for a maximum heat bylaw, going in by myself is not nearly as impactful as it is bringing in, a resident who lives in that ward and is experiencing those impacts and can talk about that experience firsthand, or a community group that represents a whole bunch of folks who are experiencing those impacts. So if you do want to be a part of that and are willing to meet with your counselor, on any given issue, first thing I would say is don't wait for us. Please just feel free to do that if it's something you're experiencing or passionate about. But second of all, you can definitely write to us and tell us. And we're gonna, in our when we do have a big vote coming up, or we're putting pressure on council about something, we're going to be really mindful to reach out to our supporters and leave those options for more than just signing on to an action. If we send out an action and you want to do more on this, please do reply and let us know that you want to actually go further and meet with your counselor and tell them about what you're experiencing, because that's going to bring huge power to anything we do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, that the two major step forwards we've seen on waste and climate, one being the single-use reduction strategy and the other being the new net zero transform TO climate strategy. That's the result of thousands of people from our communities putting pressure on council, raising their voices over years. So as much as we need to go further, we need to see regulations come into effect, we need to see plans funded properly. The fact that we've come this far is really a result of people power, community power, people who have been strong advocates for many years, who respond to city surveys, who contact their councillor, who give budget deputations, the whole range of actions. And we are seeing, as our team spoke about earlier, we've seen these commitments being adopted in municipal election platforms. We are collectively making a difference. We are moving the needle. We will need to keep pushing very hard at the political level. I think we've seen that for sure. So that's what we intend to do. I think probably we need to start wrapping up here. We really appreciate those of you who've stayed on the line longer with us in this forum. This was intended to be a quick debrief of the municipal election and just share some insight into, what we're thinking about in terms of priorities for the coming year. As I've said, and as the team has talked about, this is going to be an action-packed 12 months with a new council. It's really an important opportunity to educate councillors on community priorities and really let's own the agenda at council from a community perspective. So really excited to be on that journey with you together. And, just want to thank all of you for your support and everything you're doing on these fronts as well. And also thanks so much for, some of the helpful things that you've been saying in the chat. I know there's a rich conversation happening there as well. And yes, we look forward to collaborating over the coming year.
Thanks, everyone.